Hey folks, happy Women's History Month, happy Women's History Day, International Women's Day, if that happens to be the day you're watching it, or just happy women, right, if you're not watching it in any of these particular periods. I just wanted to take a few minutes here to give honor, give support, give some recognition and I guess some information for you guys about some of the most remarkable women in cognitive psychology. Now, I'm broadly defining this, and I'm still going to leave a ton of people out because there are just so darn many of them. But here's a quick rundown of a number of really important women in cognitive psychology. Okay? So let's get started. First, we can start with Mary Whitton Calkins, studied dreams and memory. She, in fact, was the first female president of the American Psychological Association. She studied, in fact, under such pillars, such historical figures as both Hugo Munsterberg and William James. Okay, so definitely a pillar, a real pioneer for women in psychology. Similarly speaking, Margaret Floyd Washburn was the first female to be granted a PhD in psychology, right? That's incredible. She was the second female president of the American Psychological Association, and I think perhaps most notably, as far as I'm concerned, she was an advocate both for her students and women in psychology. In fact, there's one particular occasion where, while at Vassar College, she had gone into a section of the college where the male faculty were allowed to smoke cigars, smoke pipes, and talk about research and whatever I guess they wanted to talk about, but females were not allowed. She went in there, and in fact the dean at the time, H.N. McCracken, remarked, "Miss Washburn had been intrepid enough to invade the sacred precinct of the men's smoker at psychological meetings. Marching uninvited into its midst, she had sat down and lighted a cigar. None questioned her privilege to enjoy the smoker thereafter." All right, so definitely a pioneer. Eleanor Gibson. Both her and her husband were fantastic researchers in visual perception. She herself helped to pioneer the invention of what's called the visual cleft, basically to allow for measurement of depth perception in both humans and animals. In fact, for her amazing research, she won the National Medal of Science Award in 2002, awarded to her by George H.W. Bush. How about Stella Kunliff? Let's take someone from Ireland. First female president of the Royal Statistical Society. She worked for a while for the head of the Department of Statistics at Arthur Guinness & Son Company. In fact, it was while there and put in charge of quality control that she established a number of incredibly important principles regarding experimental design. And I think maybe one of her best quotes is to say that how impossible it is to find human beings without biases, without prejudices, and without the delightful idiosyncrasies which make them so fascinating. Magda Arnold. She was an Austro-Czech-Canadian psychologist, right? That's a mouthful. She was studying the neuroscience of memory, and really importantly, if you know anything about the James Lang or the Cannon-Bard theories of emotion, we've largely rejected both of those in favor of appraisal theories, two-factor theories, and she was the first contemporary psychologist to propose an emotional appraisal theory. Brenda Milner. You may not know of her, but you certainly know about H.M., the famous amnesiac. Well, Brenda Milner, her and Henry Scoville were the ones involved in the original surgery that made H.M. an amnesiac. She then studied him extensively along with later researchers like Suzanne Corkin, right? She was a pioneer in the neuroscience of memory, and many have referred to her as the founder of neuropsychology. Davida Teller studied infant visual development. In fact, she was very, very influential in using the technique, not develop the technique, but using the technique of visual preference and combining it with signal detection techniques. In fact, one of her most notable contributions to the field has been what's called Teller acuity cards, which are used to study infant acuity or infant vision. Still to this day are found in many, many eye doctors around the world. Leslie Ungerleider. really interested in sensory processing in primates and humans at NIMH. She spent her entire career, in fact, at NIMH using PET scans, fMRI, studying first primates, and then when it became available to study neuroscience in humans, switching to those techniques to be able to allow herself to see human brains in activity, in activation as well. And so one of her most lasting contributions was to identify the difference between what we know now as the dorsal and ventral pathways, or the what-where pathways, right? So the ventral would be that what pathway involved in object recognition, and that dorsal pathway, think dorsal fin of a dolphin, goes up around the top to the parietal lobes and is involved a lot in sort of localization and object recognition in space as opposed to what an object is, right? Dorothea Jamison, absolutely influential. In fact, if you're seeing any of this presentation in color, then the reason why we know you can do it is because of the research of Dorothea Jamison. Her and her husband, Leo Hurwicz, essentially helped to demonstrate the validity of what's now known as opponent process theory. The idea that our eyes and our brain work together using these particular neurons sensitive to distinct wavelengths, distinct colors, and that it's through a combination of these colors that we're able to produce the range of colors that you and I see, the vision, the motion that we see, right? All of that explained largely by the work of Jamison and Hurwicz. Mary C. Potter, Lebanese-American cognitive psychologist, born in Beirut. She is one of the team, part of the individuals, right, along with Brenda Milner and Henry Scoville, who were involved with the discovery and initial studying of that famous patient, HM, right? One of her major contributions was to use a task called rapid serial visual presentation, which you can probably understand from the name, involves rapidly presenting stimuli at you, right, visually, and found out that the way in which people are able to quickly access meaning from these stimuli suggests that they're doing so sometimes without accessing things like semantic memory in order to do so, right? They're able to do it so rapidly that it involves some other processes, right? She's become well recognized, in fact, is a fellow at the American Psych Association, the Association for Psych Science, and a number of other places. Barbara Tversky studied psychology at University of Michigan, right? Go Blue. Was really influential in studying categorical influences on visual reasoning, right? How we might assume that one location, because of its categorical membership in another larger body of information, is therefore above, below, left, right, east, west, north, south. Other elements that we'll assume about that thing, even though they're not necessarily the truth. She's actually also been studying a lot about what's called mind in motion, action as a foundation of thinking, so to speak, right? You and I talk about everything in words. We think about everything in words, but Tversky talks about how there are some things you don't think about in words. If you were to mentally rearrange the furniture in your living room right now, doing so wouldn't necessarily take any words at all. And in her mind, language is actually a product of that spatial recognition, that spatial thought process that we're going through. Shelley Taylor, hugely influential in social cognition and health psychology. In fact, one of the big things that she talks about is perceptual salience and the bias that we have there, where we might see an individual very large in our visual field, right, takes up a huge part of our vision, and therefore must be highly influential on whatever's going on in the scene itself, right? That's clearly not the case. In fact, you could sort of liken it to situations like the old Seinfeld episode where George Costanza wanted to buy a car. He had done all this research on what car he was going to buy, and it had the best gas mileage, and it lasted a long time. And then he got to the dealership, and this other car was there that the dealer said was owned by a famous actor, Jon Voight. And he decided that was the only thing that mattered moving forward, right? That salience biased him in the way that he processed, in fact, the value of that vehicle. Another thing that she studied was perspective taking, and how taking the perspective of others not only leads to a better memory of their perspective and their actions, but also allows you to exhibit a little bit more empathy towards those actions. And she was famous. While she was at Yale, she was arrested for invading a club called Maury's. Maury's was famous for having essentially all-male social gatherings of academics. And if you weren't a member, you couldn't always get in, and females could not become members. So she invaded the place, and within a couple of months, they started to allow women. Go Shelley. Susan, Fisk, cognitive social psychologist. She actually worked with Dr. Taylor on salience and bias, and she was one of the only social psychologists, I believe the first, to take a case all the way to the Supreme Court in which she testified on gender discrimination. Through her work with Peter Glick, they came up with what's called the Ambivalent Sexism Inventory, which helps to explain some of the prejudice and sexism that females experience in the world today, and sadly probably moving forward until we fix things, right? Dorothy Ferguson, someone near and dear to my heart because she was a bulldog, right? Went to the University of Georgia just like me. In fact, was there when I was in graduate school. Comparative psychologist and primatologist, studied both captive as well as wild capuchin monkeys, and collaborated with a number of individuals in South America, including a team, I believe, in Brazil that's studying things like learning, problem solving, tool use, right? These capuchins that take these rocks and they bash open a nut so they can get to the inside. Fascinating work that Dory Ferguson has been doing. Because of it, she's a fellow at the Association for Psych Science, the American Academy for the Advancement of Sciences, and a number of other places. Dr. Morton Ann Gernsbacher is a psycholinguistics researcher, and in fact, after her son was diagnosed with autism, became hugely interested in autism and language development. And in fact, her research was one of the main things that showed that some of the language impairments that we see in autism are not due to intellectual impairments. They are simply due to motor planning, right? And we can potentially develop therapies then as a result of that sort of greater knowledge of the root cause of the issue. Mazarin Banaji, who is probably going to hear this and say, oh my goodness, you butchered my name. I'm so sorry, Dr. Banaji. She is an Indian-American cognitive social psychologist. You might not know her name, but you should, because she is huge in social psychology, right? Implicit bias in race, gender, orientation, age. You've probably heard of the implicit association test, right? Cited 4,000 times. That's her and Greenwald, okay? So they both deserve credit there. Because of the work that she's done uncovering the sort of implicit biases that people hold, she was given the U.S. Congress's Golden Goose Award in 2018. Anne Treesman, famous for attenuation theory, right? An attention model that says that we sort of lessen the volume of things we're trying to ignore while strengthening the volume or maintaining the volume of things we're trying to pay attention to. Feature integration theory, a theory that says how we take in all this visual information about size and shape and color in order to scan through our environment to identify things. She had an amazing background, right? Which explains why she's such a great researcher. She was not only trained by a great researcher, Donald Broadbent, she was married to another great researcher, so they had fantastic, stimulating conversations, right? Daniel Kahneman won a Nobel Prize, in fact, with Amos Tversky, and she herself ended up winning a National Medal of Science in 2013, awarded by President Obama, right? So fantastic contributions, Dr. Treesman. Elizabeth Warrington was a British neuropsychologist. In fact, a lot of her work over the years was to help develop more and more important and accurate diagnostic criteria for neurodegenerative disorders. But even more importantly than that, I think one of her cool contributions to cognitive psych was to show that amnesics had memories that we didn't think they should have. If they couldn't remember my name from one day to the next, and they couldn't remember what they ate for breakfast, how could they remember these other things? And so one of the ways that she showed this was with what is called the Gallan incomplete figures task. So look at that picture right there in the top right-hand corner. What does it look like? Can you identify what it might be? How about if I give you a slightly more filled-in version? How about a slightly more filled-in version? Can you identify it yet? Might be getting close, and by now you're probably able to say that it indeed is an elephant. But if I showed it to you again, so I went all the way back and I did it again, you can probably now recognize much earlier the form of that elephant. That's due to memory. Amnesics can do this too, and they can remember things like word stem completions and fragment. This is the incredible work she did with Tim Shallis on, unfortunately, an individual who had a closed head injury because of a motorcycle accident that helped to teach us so much about memory. And in fact, she is also influential in the field of semantic dementia, helping to in fact establish a lot of the criteria for defining and diagnosing semantic dementia. Well, how about Ellen Langer? Dr. Langer is a social cognitive clinical psychologist, right? So many cool fields to combine into one. She was the first female tenured in psychology at Harvard, far too late, of course, by the time it happened, but still impressive nonetheless. Studied decision-making, illusion of control, mindfulness. Really had a lot of influences on positive psychology, the idea of well-being and healthy aging, and how some of the things that we do can really contribute to a better aging, a better behavior, a better personality and well-being, as opposed to necessarily studying all the ways in which we can contribute to a lesser personality or lower well-being, right? The basic idea of positive psychology. She, in fact, has been cited so many times that in one of my favorite shows, an episode of The Simpsons, Abe Simpson, the grandfather, is experiencing some memory difficulties, and they end up going to Cuba, and Cuba had a bunch of old cars when he gets there, and he sees one of these old cars, and it helps to bring back all these old memories and helps him to feel a whole lot better. And that, in fact, was a reference to Dr. Langer's reminiscence therapy. Irene Pepperberg. If you don't know Pepperberg, you've probably heard of Alex, right? Alex is the gray parrot that she studied. She was a researcher, is a researcher in animal cognition and language. Studied animal communication absolutely extensively, mostly in Alex for the longest time, but then in additional gray parrots and then other parrots as well. She came up with what's called the model rival technique, where essentially you've got a model that teaches a behavior to a potential student while the animal watches. They both learn it, but the human student can behave back the thing, and then the parrot tries to compete for the trainer, the model's attention. And right, so they go back and forth, and it's essentially a way to ensure that the animal is communicating back and forth and is learning to model that particular behavior, right? It's a really, really cool technique, fairly powerful. In fact, it's been thought recently that it might be useful in helping with autism and the sort of language development issues that we sometimes see in those individuals. Eleanor Roche, formerly known as Hyder, she's got publications all over the place in both of her last names, really was interested in categorization of knowledge. In fact, she was so interested in it that she started this really cool research on cross-cultural similarities and categories, right? Every culture sees color. Do we have the same cognitive structure of that categorical knowledge? Well, doing so, and she literally wrote the book on categories here, she studied the Dani tribe, right? A tribe that actually only had two words in their entire language to refer to color. And doing so essentially was able to lend evidence to the larger Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that language and thought are interdependent. Right now, actually, she's been studying things like Buddhism and Western religion and how they can inform modern psychology. Lita Cosmetics. Lita Cosmetics actually was a cognitive psychologist who was originally educated at both Harvard and Stanford, right? So definitely a hardcore background that brought to her and her outlook a lot of research founding. She, in fact, with her anthropologist husband, John Tooby, co-developed evolutionary psychology, which is now hugely influential. The field that basically says that many of our behaviors, in fact all, if not all, of our behaviors are produced through a natural selection process, right? Memory, for example, favors emotional material, probably because historically, if organisms could remember the fearful as well as beneficial events, they were likely to survive more than the organisms that couldn't remember such things. Nina Krauss, neuropsycholinguist, inventor, and a musician, right? Pretty impressive. She can do everything. Really interested in the neural encoding of speech and music. And in fact, one of the really cool things that I think she can do, or has done in her research, is shown how individuals with auditory training, so say a musician or somebody who learns to play a particular instrument, has additional benefits in these sort of other sensory cognitive ways, right? So the brain actually will show different ways of activation and potentially improvements in other sensory cognitive mechanisms as a result of this auditory training, right? So, hey, learn to play an instrument, right? Good advice from Dr. Krauss. Elizabeth Bates, neuropsychologist studying language acquisition, was really interested in the concept of neuroplasticity, the idea that the brain can change over time in children and adults, and found that children, in fact, and she's not the only one to have shown this, can still develop pretty much intact language skills even if they've lost an entire hemisphere, even if they've lost that left hemisphere that we know to be responsible for language. And she basically says that language is a byproduct of that plasticity, not of the particular structures like Broca's or Wernicke's area that you might have learned about. Diane Halpern. Dr. Halpern was a former president of the American Psych Association, huge advocate for gender equality in education, and in fact was part of Ulrich Neisser's task force to essentially write a reply against the controversial book The Bell Curve, which said that much of America's social structure was due to prolonged changes in intelligence, right? A controversial book essentially saying that the upper class were smarter than the lower class. Huge report to have written against that thing. And she has also studied on her own, though this may somewhat seem like an opposing idea, gender differences in cognitive abilities, and largely shown that there are not that many of them. Right, so the genders are in fact largely equal in their cognitive abilities, though we may sometimes take different routes to get to the same outcome. Esther Thalen, cognitive developmental psychologist. In fact, her and Linda Smith, who we'll talk about shortly, co-authored Dynamical Systems Theory, essentially, and this is a big picture idea, right? Applied physics and chaos theory to motor movements of infants, talking about how the physical actions and the physical interactions with the environment led to this concept of the cognitive self, from who you are and how you interact with the environment as an individual. Barbara Smuts. Dr. Smuts began studying animal behavior at U of M and is still there. In fact, she studied with Jane Goodall for some time, though she may have mixed memories of that because she was part of a small group that was kidnapped and tortured by a group of communist rebels at the time. So maybe perhaps not her happiest moment studying animals, but she has studied baboons for a long time, in particular studying friendship and sexual activity in baboons. And well, it might not surprise you, but female baboons are more likely to give up sexual access to male baboons who have been nice to them in the past and who have shown some niceness to their offspring. Right? So perhaps a lesson for all organisms out there. She's studied bottlenose dolphins. She's in fact studying dogs now as well. So she's studied animal behavior across the spectrum. Linda B. Smith, cognitive and linguistic development. Like I said, she co-authored Dynamical Systems Theory with Esther Thalen. One of the things that she was particularly interested in was shape bias. The idea that when children generalize the meaning of nouns, they sometimes do so based on the shape of the object it describes and its similarity to other shapes, right? So really influential work on how children acquire and fine-tune their language. Marcia Johnson's a cognitive neuropsychologist, actually influenced a lot of my own research on source monitoring and unconscious plagiarism. Looked originally with her researcher colleague John Bransford at things like schematic influences on memory, and how when we have an abstract story, it's difficult for us to remember it, but if we're given a schema as provided by a picture like this one, it allows us to attach those things into memory much more efficiently, and we can remember them for a lot longer. Her work went into reality and source monitoring. She also came up with what's called the modular entry into memory model. She has been hugely influential in the field of memory. And as a prolific author, she's in fact written a statistics book and a book on how to succeed in college. Susan Gelman, a cognitive developmental psychologist still at U of M. Definitely a huge researcher out there. In fact, recently awarded with a distinguished professorship. She studies language development in children, essentialism, the idea that everything out there has an essence. Right? This really can go back to the idea of mental concepts, or if you want to go to Greek philosophy, what Plato called forms. A cat is a cat because of certain characteristics that a cat has, right? A dog is a dog because of the characteristics that a dog has. How do children form these distinctions between these mental concepts? They both have four legs, they both have fur. What things do they store as different? She does a lot of this work out of what she calls the Conceptual Development Lab. I love this place. In fact, I've brought my daughter to the Conceptual Development Lab on a number of occasions to participate in research, and among her many other awards, has been given the G. Stanley Hall Award for Distinguished Contribution to Developmental Psychology, right? So huge in developmental cognition. Sue Savage Rumbaugh is a cognitive primatologist studying language in bonobos. In fact, one of the only individuals to have ever studied language in bonobos. She used these giant cards, if you will, with all these sort of pictures on them that corresponded to different symbols that she could use to study the language abilities of these bonobos. Famous for studying two particular ones individual, Kanzi and Panbanisha. Panbanisha is going to be so upset I probably butchered her name. near and dear to me, right? She's a tie-dye wearer. Really interested in studying language formation and imitation in primates. And essentially, her views are that primates can speak and use language in nearly the same abilities that we can. In other words, that language is not tied strictly to humans, that other animals and other species can experience it as well. Controversial views, not always held by some of the other animal researchers that are out there. Nancy Canwisher, Ellen Swallow Richards professor at MIT, okay, big name here. She, in fact, got all of her degrees at MIT, worked with Mary Potter and Anne Treesman. That's just some of her pedigree. She, as a neuroscientist, helped to discover two major areas in the brain, as well as her number of other contributions. The fusiform face area, the part of your brain essentially responsible for, I can't point at it because it's within there, right? Part of your brain responsible for identifying faces, particularly familiar faces. And then the parahippocampal place area, which allows you to recognize contexts or scenes, right? The environment around things. And somewhat famous Dr. Canwisher, I love her to death, she's amazing for this, shaved her head during a lecture on neuroanatomy just so that she could draw the brain onto her scalp and show her students where these particular regions were, because some of them were struggling to visualize the concepts. Patricia Goldman Rakesh, she was a neuropsychologist studying memory in primates. In fact, she was one of the first to really look at the prefrontal cortex to see how it was organized and how it supported processes in working memory, right? Looking at things like the ocular motor delayed response task, where primates would move their eyes to a target location only after the target had been lit up. When they did that, and the time between the light up and when they moved, she showed this activation in these neurons that seemed to be responsible for a sort of a maintenance of working memory, holding on to the memory of where that light had been so that they could move their eyes to it when they were directed to. She also studied things like dopamine and how it then became influential in our understanding of schizophrenia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. So Dr. Goldman Rakesh had massive influence on the field and unfortunately died in 2003 because of a tragic car accident. If not, she'd probably still be contributing to the field today. Dr. Kroll, Judith Kroll, is a psycholinguist studying language development, in particular studying bilingualism and language activation. And one of the cool things that she showed was that when somebody who's bilingual speaks one of their languages or uses one of their languages, both languages become active in the brain. Because of the work that she's done, she is essentially a fellow everywhere. APA and APS. She's co-founder of the Women in Cognitive Science, right? Dr. Kroll is an amazing researcher. Elizabeth Loftus, cognitive psychologist, memory researcher. If you don't know Elizabeth Loftus, then you will know Dr. Loftus before you've graduated. She is hugely influential in the fields of false memory and eyewitness testimony, giving, in fact, testimony about the fallibility of memory in numerous high-profile cases. She's been influential in what's called the Innocence Project, using DNA to exonerate individuals who were falsely convicted in almost every case of some eyewitness testimony. She's famous in cognitive psych, particularly for her development of things like the misinformation effect. Dr. Loftus will forever be sort of the pillar of false memory and eyewitness testimony research. Ellen Bialystok, cognitive developmental neuropsychologist, studied bilingualism in children and adults. In fact, showing how when you're bilingual, you tend to have these sort of side advantages, if you will, in executive control, in non-verbal executive control, in fact, simply as a function of knowing this bilingualism. And, in fact, that advantage in executive control seems to survive into older adulthood. So it gives this sort of buffering effect into aging, such that these individuals will have a healthy, higher cognitive function into older adults. And the idea is that perhaps because they have to go back and forth between their two different languages all the time, they are better at switching. They're better at executive control of memory, and that ends up providing some benefit into older adulthood. Lisa Feldman Barrett is a cognitive affective neuroscientist, essentially saying that the basic emotions like happiness and sadness and things like that are not biologically hardwired. They're not tied to specific regions of the brain necessarily. They don't come as a function of some innate hardwiring. Instead, they sort of come about as a function of your brain's attempt to talk to itself, right? A sort of communication conundrum is one thing that she's called it. She's been the past president of the Association for Psych Science, and in fact is one of the most cited scientists in the world. She said, in every waking moment, your brain uses past experience, organized as concepts, to guide your actions and give your sensations meaning. When the concepts involved are emotion concepts, your brain constructs instances of emotion. Lynn Hasher, cognitive neuropsychologist studying things like attention and control of working memory, along with her longtime collaborator Rose Zaks, another fantastic female cognitive psychologist. Most recently, she's been looking at things like circadian rhythms and time of day effects in older adults, and showing how, because of the way in which the circadian rhythms affect cognitive function, certain individuals, particularly older adults, will be prone to be higher functioning at certain times of day compared to other times of the day. I don't know about you, but it's getting late here and I'm getting lower functioning. Patricia Kuhl, a developmental psycholinguist. One of the cool things that forgive the pun, that she was interested in is language acquisition. In fact, Dr. Kuhl came up with what's called the sort of native language magnet. That's one term for her theory that talks about the way in which our native language, so mine is English, I don't know about you, warps or modifies the sounds we can make and the sounds that we can hear. In fact, such that at birth and up until probably about 9 months or so, we can hear and make almost all the sounds of all the languages that exist in the world, and probably some that don't exist. But after that period, and you can see this blue period here is theoretically when that sort of sensitive period of language development is occurring, we can no longer correctly discriminate these speech sounds, right? Because we are only exposed to English, we can no longer discriminate the Mandarin sounds, as you can see in this figure, whereas the Taiwanese students, those infants who were exposed to Mandarin sounds, still can, right? It's fine-tuning what sounds we can hear, what sounds we can't. And in fact, it's because of her incredible work that in 2001, she was invited to be part of the Presidential Summit on Early Cognitive Development called Ready to Read, Ready to Learn. And Dr. Knowlton, Barbara Knowlton, is a cognitive neuropsychologist really studying the differences between memory systems, okay? Explicit memory, implicit memory. If there are some things I can just do, but I can't really tell you how to do, like rollerblading or playing baseball or playing the violin. It's hard for me to explain to you how I do these things. I just do them. Those all reside in implicit memory. But where is this implicit memory? Well, Dr. Knowlton developed a really creative weather prediction task. And I won't get into the details of all of it, but essentially she used this task along with fMRI and a couple of other neuroimaging techniques to show that individuals with damage to an area called the dorsal striatum, to be really broad, could not learn these habits or these implicit memories. And in doing so, essentially demonstrated that all of our habit, implicit, what you might call motor or muscle memories, reside within this dorsal striatum system, whereas our more explicit memories reside either in our cortex or hippocampus, the point being we have different anatomical structures to help support our different memory systems. And it's in part because of Dr. Knowlton's fantastic research that we know that sort of thing. Okay, that was, 40 or so amazing female researchers, and it doesn't even scratch the surface, right? There's all these. And maybe you, right? You're just watching it now. Get inspired. Be one of these people. And if you're not female, who cares? Go out there and be amazing too. Thank you. I hope this was at least slightly enjoyable. I know I had to go quick, and I couldn't by any means talk in depth about any of these amazing researchers, but I wanted to get it done in time for International Women's Day, so thank you so much. Have a fantastic Women's Day, Women's Month, Women's Year, Women's everything. This is Dr. Clark Foos from the University of Michigan Dearborn, thanking you yet again.